And for those that are joining us, welcome on board. You join us at the Kickstarter segment, and we are going to be discussing the impact of the conflict in Somalia on the region, improving regional relations and geopolitical stability here. I'll be introducing my guest a little bit later, but let me first bring you up to speed with the preamble of our discussion this morning. There are some positive and encouraging developments on democratic governance of the African continent. However, bigger challenges currently appear to outweigh the success stories. Residents of the Sahel region and parts of the Horn of Africa face continued insecurity, instability, and armed conflict. The latest episode in that dilemma is an attack on a UPDF base in Bulo Mare, that is 120 kilometers out of the capital Mogadishu, that has sent shockwaves across the region. Here in Uganda, the Uganda People's Defense Forces has issued a statement that a team led by General Kayanja Muhanga, who is the commander of land forces, has been dispatched to go and find out exactly what happened and also find a way forward. The president has also spoken, tweeting and expressing his dismay at what he described as panicky soldiers. Reports on facts emerging is that the attack lasted at least 30 minutes, and after 30 minutes the UPDF withdrew to the west of the Bulo Mare. Now, the details will be coming through, of course, including on the fatalities. We do not have that anywhere that we can verify. Joining me for this discussion is a political analyst, Joseph Ochieno, who is also a member of the Uganda People's Congress Party, one of the oldest in the country. A very warm welcome to the program. Good morning.
Good morning. So it's a sad morning, really.
As you introduced, it's the case that we're almost certainly sure that many families in Uganda will be grieving this morning. And over the weekend, the problem is that we don't know how many families are involved, not only grieving, but families of those substantially injured in Somalia. So it's a grim morning. But that said, it's a bit of a shock that we're in a new world, and a new world in which I think we need to have energy, courage, civility, and a sense of global purpose. Now, if we are able to address these issues, I'm concerned that while we are in a nation in post-conflict a situation ourselves, it would appear that we are substantially stretched beyond our own borders, in this case engaged in Somalia. Whatever the reasons, that's a slightly different question. From a political perspective, as UPC, I'm still quite concerned about why and how we are in Somalia. But that said, citizens of this country, my relatives, your relatives, I have close relatives in the army and in other security networks. They're out there doing this bidding. It may be an opportunity for us to review our own situation, not only in Somalia, but here in the country, including where we really substantially deploy most of our resources, as we strategically begin to think of a new world order in which terrorism seems to be part of a way in which people seek to resolve their political differences.
Okay, of course, the duty to explain the extent of loss of troops is, or rather falls on the Uganda Force Commander, who is Lieutenant General Sam Okeding, and he took over on the 14th of May. Is it this year or last year? The details, I'll be finding out that, but that it falls on him to explain and also give us some details there on loss. For now, we do not know, but a senior security analyst...
Can I just interject there?
Yes.
Possibly not necessarily. If some minor incident, it's the case. An issue like this should require that Mr. Museveni, when he was issuing his statement, which is actually very interesting, was perhaps seeming to suggest that there's some laziness elsewhere. It should really come from the head of state, number one. Number two, if it's not the head of state, should be the Minister of Defense coming out very clearly stating what the position is and the fatalities and casualties involving the citizens of this country. Okay. It's really at that level.
Okay. Yeah. Well, talking of the fact that it's at the level where the head of state, who is also commander-in-chief of the armed forces, should be coming out with just about every detail on this, including the loss of soldiers. Let's just hear how we covered that story there.
Now, these people, because Al-Shabaab was very weak, had been weakened, it has not been attacking for a long time, and they couldn't attack the defense of NRA, of UPDF. It is suicidal, because the attack started at what you call in your English way 10 past 5, when it was still dark. Now, if people are not well prepared, fighting in the dark can also be another problem. They can just panic for no reason. And yet, there is a way we fight in the dark, it's a well-known way. But Al-Shabaab will pay. We don't have big support forces there, like Air Force and long-range artillery and so on. They have light equipment, which was doing well. So I was speaking with those people there, Major General Okuding, who is the force commander, and another brigadier called Brigadier Omola. And I was telling them that if the Turkish and the Americans don't want to support our ground forces, we shall support them ourselves. We shall find a way of intervening more decisively, like we did with the ADF. ADF is crushed here in Congo.
To members of Parliament about the attack, and of course expressing dismay at what he described as panic on the part of the soldiers. He also reveals something, that the attacks do happen in the early wee hours of the morning. A report on the last 3 attacks also indicates that around 5 a.m. is when some of these attacks happen. Whether that should be reason enough for Uganda People's Defense Forces soldiers to panic is another debate. Let me return to studio and reintroduce my guest. And of course, we are joined by another. Let me begin with Alawi Semanda, international relations expert. Many thanks for joining us on Morning at NTV. How are you doing?
Very well, thank you very much.
Good. I had already introduced the usual suspect, eminent political analyst Joseph Otieno, who had given us a preamble of what he thinks ought to be the response that was given by the president. I'll be coming to you, Alawi, very shortly. Let me just be able to ensure that this conversation, especially the aspects you spoke about, Joseph, in the intro, are driven home. You spoke about what was, the loss of life is something that we shouldn't even be able to dilly-dally about. No. The fact that we have no statement that even attempts to give us an idea of the loss of life is telling. I do not know whether, of course, within the military, there is need to first consult the immediate family members before information can be revealed. But at national security level, should we be so hamstrung to this extent?
It is shocking, and as I said, particularly because this is an operation which is still substantially controversial. The country was not sufficiently consulted on why and whether or not we needed to have sent our children to go to Somalia. From a UBC perspective, this is something that we've been very concerned about from the beginning. But regardless, as I said, this cannot be a partisan issue. National security shouldn't be. I know the guys who like to do so are possibly at the moment in charge. The fact that an attack has happened I know Mr. Museveni knows the gravity of the whole thing. You come and you don't have to go into the graphic details, the names. You simply have to assure the nation this is the gravity of the situation. This is what happened. You give surface general detail and assurances. But also I must say this, that I found it extraordinary that the first statement coming from Mr. Museveni was almost seemingly to suggest that our young men and women who were involved in Somalia somehow perhaps panicked. You know, this is a time when you should actually talk about the brevity, the courage, the sacrifice that these young people, these people are making, and that perhaps they've been taken granted by surprise. So, you know, there's always need for some kind of humility, but you make a statement as if, as you say, somebody said, you know, you've been found off guard, you're taking a casual cup of tea. But even then, if you're a head of state, you should be able to do that. But at the end of the day, this is not a matter for Mr. Museveni, it's a matter for this country, all of us, and particularly to the extent that there's some graphic things doing the rounds, you know, in that I don't like to watch. I don't like to watch violence.
No, it's not good for the eye.
Some of those figures are down. Some of those figures and incidents and events are down. That I'm not quite sure is worth the discussion. It's actually very horrific what has actually happened. It's very, very scary. You know, so we need much more of a national assurance that not only our people who are there, some of the families I don't know, I would be quite surprised if all of them know that their kids are safe. But as I said, all of us have got relatives.
That's
right. That we don't know in many cases who are the guys who are deployed there and who are not deployed there. So this country needs to feel that you know, it's being guided and led by people responsible and whom we pay to be able to protect us, and particularly if they go out of their way to do whatever they've done, is unfortunate. But it's a tragic moment.
It's a tragic moment indeed. Let's have an international perspective to this. Before the attack, Mr. Semanda, we appeared to think that perhaps we had reached a level of sustainable stability within Somalia and the Horn of Africa, let alone, or rather, the instability in Sudan notwithstanding, because it again brings in some new perspective and another equation. I don't know whether it's to blame anyway, but what was your take on hearing the news of the attack, and what does that mean going forward?
Well, thank you very much. First of all, it is, as you've clearly discussed, I think it is very tragic, but even the response, in my view, was very, very for lack of better word, wanting. You see, one of the questions should be, what you are doing now, we are responding. And again, it's now like Al-Shabaab is determining the security questions we should be answering. If you see the response we've had, and we are even allowing the Al-Shabaab guys to tell us, to take their narrative, the number of casualties. I would have expected and this is not to understand that probably the president may be, being a father of the nation, he was also grieving as he was telling us that guys were panicking. But at least he would have told us that as of now, we believe this number of people, this is the number of fatalities. But we'll keep you posted. Then they keep updating us. But if you don't at this time, we take the number which Al-Shabaab is claiming,
and this is part of the terror propaganda, because just sorry for interjecting on that, but I just want to ensure that this point is driven home as effectively as it must. Propaganda on the part of terror networks is an effective weapon in ensuring their narrative reaches the targets. And when they say, for example, that 139 UPDF soldiers were put out of action, and then you're not effectively countering that narrative, then you begin to cause a lot of fear that, well,
to make their number
if the other guys can put it at 139, and then it could be well within 100.
The fact is, world over, being the US, being the UK, everywhere, whenever there is a terror attack, it is always very difficult to get to know the exact number of fatalities. But at least we get a picture. They give us a picture, then they keep updating. The numbers can be contradicted at any time, but we've not seen this. You posed a question that we seem to be that things were getting better. And this to me makes me to wonder even if African Union is very serious in any way, or countries that are involved in Somalia, if they are. You know, they've always told us that Al-Shabaab has about between 7,000 to 13,000 fighters. If it is true that that is the number, then the countries that are in Somalia, we are jokers, and I wouldn't want to say that. But I can't believe this. How can 7,000 people beat intelligence of strong countries? We have Kenya, we have Uganda, we have Burundi. And again, let's also not forget that politics, both regional politics and international politics, it is also at center of this. In securitization, sometimes you'll find there will be I also tend to question when it comes for us to defining even the terrorism in its way. Because who defines terrorism, first of all? Who tells us this is a terrorist? We've seen when in some countries, when people are disturbing the government, they will be branded terrorist. And if you go to the critical people who define terrorism like Chomsky, he will tell you that even state actors, they engage in terrorism. Actually,
the ability to administer violence onto another is
he
terror
will tell
in
you
itself.
that those who do wholesale terrorism are state actors. But of course, if you can take out of action about 100 people, that would be. But the other point we should look at is what are the interests in Somalia, or what makes the Al-Shabaab guys get arms? Because clearly, if we wanted to disable them by curtailing their sources of income, it would be very possible. But also, if you get a country from a distance, we can say, I know that we have a coast close to Somalia as far as economic interests are concerned. But the Somalis, in this case, would have played a greater role. Our role as African countries would be to support Somalis, but not to go and fight on their behalf.
In other words, you think there is a lack of commitment for the Somali government to effectively take care of their situation. They could have reasons, including lack of capacity. That is the reason
I don't want to call it lack of willingness, because you know, security things sometimes are difficult to freely express. But sometimes you find that they had no choice. They were, many countries had to go in, and these countries had different interests. The primary reason being, of course, security, to pacify the region, but also, don't forget, for example, it plays politically. You remember Nkurunziza before, in 2013, when he threatened to withdraw forces from Somalia, there was a reason, because the deployment, for example, for Nkurunziza, for Kenya and other countries, if you want to mention them, for them it gives their home leaders opportunity to shine globally, to be consulted, to be seen as peacemakers of the region. But again, it brings dividends either to them from political perspective or to their countries. Remember, people are paid. And I don't want to say that they go specifically for money, but you can imagine when
the president has spoken about that. He says the soldiers are not mercenaries, to look at money as the driving factor. But that's pretty good perspective. Allow me return to Joseph Otieno. And with regard to the fact that the workings of a terror group are pretty much what is happening, they can decide to sit for years without an attack. And then when they think it is about time and they are able to exploit the lapses, then they hit, just like they did. It could be the scenario, but also it could be a case of taking advantage of the latest lapses in security in light of what is happening in Sudan. Is there a correlation?
Yes, and just to say very quickly that I'm really sorry, but it's important. that you refer to Mr. Museveni's suggestion, very quick observation in that tiny statement that these are not mercenaries. It's almost as if he was trying to qualify something. I picked that with a lot of interest.
Okay.
But that said, you know, I pick on an important point you're trying to raise about ownership and sovereignty on this question of terrorism and nation states. At the end of the day, the situation in Somalia will have to be resolved ultimately by Somalis. In Uganda, when the Tanzanians supported the liberation war against Idi Amin, a liberation war for which my party was at the helm, both politically and militarily, as soon as 79 came, as soon as 1980, in fact, even before 1980, even before Bote returned to Uganda, there was this thing about whether or not Tanzanians were occupiers and when they were going back. So it turns out that actually by 1981 or thereabout, Tanzanians had actually gone back, with the exception of a few instructors. Go to Southern Africa. The Americans, I mean the South African Boers occupying Angola and Namibia, were whipped up. It is about people's determination to claim back their state. In Britain, the British tried in Ireland. They whipped out, you know, the Americans with all their global firepower. You know, they faced it in Iraq, in Afghanistan, count the rest of the other countries, and then come back to Somalia. Do you know, the Somali question was one in which the Americans tried, we talk of strategic interests here, to go into down there. This situation arose as a result of the Americans getting a humiliation in Somalia and pulling out. Hence, really, Uganda and others, and I don't want to go into that because the fact, people went there not in terms of Pan-Africanism, agenda, whatever. No, it is basically to send African guys to go and fight and die, you know, instead of Anglo-American interest. But we don't want to talk so heavily on that. Point here is the determination and resolve of people when it comes to the sovereignty of their nation states. People will give in anything and everything to claim their space. At the moment, so therefore, the point we are raising is the guys in Somalia who are much more resolved than anybody else are Somalis. And terror, as Mr. Museveni will know, how they themselves subjected this country, including Kampala. Yes, you will send slight little boys to go and throw a grenade somewhere along Bombo Road, and it will cause havoc. One little boy, and the boy can wait for 9 months, so long as you're planning whatever you're going to plan, and it has an impact. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. I think this incident calls for a general review from Uganda's perspective. But I also understand the dilemma that the regional states face, with the exception, I think, of, in this case, Eritrea. There must be an urgent conversation to review how we're able to support Somalia, a country which is substantially mired into identity question, particularly one around clans. Complexities that I think, when we come in as nation states, we seem to come to instruct in terms of the basis of our powers, rather than dealing with the underlying issues.
I mean, you cannot disregard the fact that many times when other powers are intervening in helping countries come to terms with their own concerns and challenges on security, there is a tendency to talk at people, not to people. The clan system in Somalia has been at the helm of some of these challenges right from the time of Mohammed Farah Aidid. The fact that some warlords are actually clan leaders and they are very powerful. So until Somalia perhaps gets to a point where it understands how to bring those political dynamics together and then find peace and order, then perhaps it will be a very difficult question to resolve. Allow me to come back to Alawi on the AU. You spoke about the fact that it is nowhere. The region itself is already grappling with something that has thrown the spanner in the works. Sudan. You know, Sudan has Yemen to it because a certain General Hemeti is widely seen as one who can be able to well, take on or rather play to the interests of Yemen, especially when it comes to the rise of Islamists. Then, just 7 months ago, the US ambassador arrived in Khartoum. After that, things are where they are. It's interesting when an American ambassador comes into a nation. It's always very interesting. The AU could be immobilized right now to act. There are a lot of other challenges the AU is dealing with. We have our own DR Congo that continues to, put us in a situation that is uncomfortable. What should be the best possible way to get to this question?
First of all, is that, sometimes it is also heartbreaking when you are talking about the African Union. I think in this case, we don't have any say. First of all, the conflict that has erupted in Sudan has put AU at spotlight. Remember, the sitting government in Khartoum came as a result of coup d'etat. And African Union stand was, if you do a coup, we will not recognize you.
We don't recognize
but
you.
now they've been boxed. They had to accept and sit and negotiate with them. But African Union does not have a big say. A country alone, like Egypt, which is part of African Union, has a greater say in Sudan itself, as we are talking, than the entire continent body. For example, we've seen Khartoum receiving arms from Cairo at a time when the conflict was just starting, before it reached this level. We also saw Libya, which is disintegrated as we are talking, also receiving. But again, the international forces, as we are talking, also have a big say. And don't forget, you've talked of General Kameti, the Libyan forces, rebels through Russia, also have interest. But not only them,
wow,
we also see a country like France. Of course, Russia will not be playing, and you find that France, the US are not also involved. They have interest.
They have interest,
but if you see the Yemen question, if you see the with Houthi rebels, then you see the United Arab Emirates, they all have interests than actually African Union, because for us, we don't know what we want. So you find that even when it comes to discussing, for example, why would the US now be leading, or Jeddah in Saudi Arabia? You would have expected the regional countries, you'd have expected African Union to be at the helm of this, but they are also looking for support from spectators. The other big part that I also see, don't also forget European Union, unfortunately. Remember the Rapid Response Forces, they have received millions of euros from the European Union to help them on ending the illegal immigrants to Europe. So they have had sustained funding for so long. So you can imagine, if they had no funds, that would mean that probably they would be crippled. But remember, they have allies, both in the EU, they have allies.
Wow.
But this is not to say that the EU has openly supported the war, but they have funded these guys for so long. But the government, the fact that it is still continuing to receive arms, even the Rapid Response Unit, it tells you that the continent and regional leaders, they have failed. I would have expected them to quickly call for strict measures to make sure that they don't receive arms. They would question the interest of Egypt. Why are you arming one party at this time when the conflict is raging?
The Horn of Africa, of course, what is going to happen in the next 6 months will be very, very important. Allow me, Joseph, to ask you, so you can help us bring the perspective of the international politics on board. The G7 just met recently, and the African Union representative at the G7 was Comoros. When you look at the powers that be on the African continent, that is not the nation you would expect to be representing the AU, but you would understand the G7 because the big boys are now allying with Russia, and China.
Yes.
So we have a whole new dynamic that is playing out when it comes to the ability of the AU to act as fast on aspects it sees as interests that are heavily looking towards Europe and the West. Are we seeing a new Cold War proxy that we are going to be mired in, and we have absolutely no idea how to even respond, and that the security question is going to become again more complex and hard to deal with?
The Cold War never ended, unfortunately, and for Africa as basically the battleground for the Cold War primarily, except the big wars, if you can pick some of the Gulf conflicts that we're referring, and some of the more recent Middle East situations. The Cold War was substantially fought on the continent and continues to be so. But the other thing, though, is that Africa, as well seems to suggest, has really never had leadership since the collapse of the Cold War. If Mr. Mandela, when he came up, had possibly been slightly much more focused, you know, and this is, I know people don't like critical observations about popular leaders. So if Mr. Mandela had provided slightly much more deeper, more serious Africanist leadership and helped to embed some of the bad boys below him, the Musevenis and others, to reawaken African nationalism, as it were, maybe we would have found that by the time the Thabo Mbekis were coming, and Mbeki was attempting to reassert not only South African but much more of an African authority and voice, we would have claimed an African identity, an African leadership, an African voice, an Africanist agenda. We do not have that. When China and Russia emerged, and particularly China, when China emerged in the last 20 or so years, China came with this interest, but because we basically merely had to respond. We responded in a situation in which, of course, they're old allies because they're supporting us during the Cold War, particularly the Southern African liberation struggles. But generally, we need, so without an agenda. Fast forward, what I'm trying to say, today, Africa is basically just like an average young, beautiful lady who's 21, I must talk about as an adult, going to have fun at a local club, a local pub, you know, let's have a dance. And it's nothing else. Because, you know, at the end of the day, African regional leaders today would be galvanizing around what is the crisis facing us in DR Congo, and how do we collectively come as a continent, not only to support Congo, but also to engage with other forces and other interests that, you know, from outside Africa that have got interest in Congo, so that we are cohesive. It has failed by and large. The situation in South Sudan continued to battle between the two leaders post the separation of the nation state. It's a quagmire. Then you come into the situation in Sudan, it is sort of the whole thing. Take us to Somalia. In Somalia is actually very interesting, because, as I said, the Kenyans are there, the Ethiopians are there, the Egyptians are there, we are there, the Burundi are there. But sort of what is the critical purpose? Are we saying that, look, Somalia is our home, Somalia is our brethren, we are supporting the Somalian authorities, the Somalian people, and you other people coming from either the Middle East or the European Union, the rest of the world, you're coming to work with us when we are leading on it? It's not happening like that. So as long as such kind of leadership is not there, as I said, we will basically be fudging solutions to these situations. And it's not surprising that Somalia, you walk one step forward and another step back. It will come seemingly, unfortunately, from maybe two back. You'll come from Somalia, come back to the Sudan, and as Awal says, it would appear the rest of the world are determining the outcome. But those outcomes, even if it ends in the stability then in Sudan, stability in Congo, unfortunately, the Sudanese stability, in this case possibly Somalia, it will be stability on terms of other interests rather than stability on the interests of the African people. And so just the other week, the last week, we're celebrating African liberation. And I look back and I say, what really are we celebrating? And I mourn, and I cry for African liberation leaders. They're absolutely absent. I'll keep on saying again and again and again. This continent is in a massive crisis for leadership. Whatever's happening in Somalia, regardless of the other underlying issues, including religious conflicts, global terrorism, all those kind of things, in the absence of African leadership means the vulnerability of the continent continues.
Alawi, speaking of vulnerability of the continent, stepping out or taking a lesser aggressive stance by regional leaders in Somalia is not the solution. Absolutely not. Though when you listen to Otieno, he speaks of, or rather suggests, that the competing interests themselves could be responsible for much of the uncoordinated troop movements with regard to strategic policy. How do you see a case where, for example, President Museveni has already begun having talks to resolve the issue in Sudan? Some people are saying, hey, you have more important issues to deal with than to attempt to resolve conflict between two generals who appear to be fighting personal than national battles. Where do we go forward? Do you see a retreat? ATMIS, or the mission there, according to the Uganda People's Defense Forces, is not deterred by this latest incident, and the commitment still remains.
You see, commitments to Somalis, to Ugandans.
Commitment to the mandate of ATMIS.
And who determined the agenda of, who funds them? Who funds the forces that are fighting in Somalia
The
now?
United States.
And are we mercenaries or we are not? You know, these are questions we must look. Because it's a security, I must be very careful again on this. But I also want to tell you, as he put it, even whatever means we go through to settle the Somali question, at the end we will have settled it at the interest of not Somalis, at the interest of not Africans, but the person who is funding. Remember, as he rightly put it, when the Americans were pulled, their dead bodies were pulled on the streets, that's when we saw things starting to turn, and eventually the coming up of Al-Shabaab and the branding them of being terrorists, maybe they are, and eventually we saw countries getting in. I think at this time it should not be about blaming. We must find a solution. The solution must be, first of all, must be local. The Somalis must be involved deeply. I would have expected us to support, to do the more training. And we have a vivid example now. What are they doing to Ukrainians? They are training their forces, even on using fighter jets. Let's put more emphasis on training Somalis, give them capacity. What we are doing now is not enough. Let's arm the government very well of Somalia, other than saying we should get our people to go and fight for them. I think it would be better, because we've done this for about 10 years.
When you talk about capacity building and the need to arm Somalis to be able to take care of matters, I'll just bring you the perspective to it. Within the Straits of Hormuz, that is near Iran and these other countries, the United States has a fleet. You know, and when you talk about a fleet has what they describe as the rapid response expeditionary force. These are guys, if you watch movies,
that's right,
Navy SEALs,
yes, that's right,
guys who can respond in under 5 minutes.
Yes.
Somalia is just kilometers away from the fleet. And if United States has the greater interest in ensuring that security within the Horn of Africa is taken care of, why would an attack go on for 45 minutes and you don't have an expeditionary rapid response force helping, when it can go into Khartoum and within 45 minutes it has taken its officials and Americans out?
You see, first of all, again, it goes to the real interest. The real interest. As you might be very much aware, Americans will do whatever it takes to go and save one life of an American. Yes. They will do whatever it takes.
Are you suggesting because there are no more Americans in Somalia, anybody else can die?
I wouldn't be wrong to think so. I wouldn't, because we've seen these things happening. But again, remember also the geopolitics of the region, especially the Americans would be more interested in seeing their forces that are in the Strait of Hormuz, because Iran a few days ago was testing their ballistic, they recently, so their eyes are more focused.
Maybe they are dealing with the fact, maybe they are dealing with the fact that the Taliban have crossed to that area.
Partly their eyes are more focused, but partly, of course, they're cleverer than most of us sometimes. and that is they have to pretend, and let me say it bluntly, they have to pretend to be neutral. They have to pretend not to be engaged, and that's why in this case they have to pretend they're not involved in Somalia, particularly because none of their own is involved. In fact, if it was the case that, well, they would send, and it's an important point, if they were to send an urgent rescue team to us, they would be told, the rest of the world would be saying, see, look at them, we told you they were children, said, well, you know, so they're being partisan. So it's basically that. So we know it's complicated, but it's basically that's really the answer.
All right.
Just a quick one, if you don't mind.
Pretty much.
No, arming the Somalis to give them capacity is one way. But the underlying issue is you have to take a holistic approach. Somalia has to be enabled through education. Somalia has to be enabled through economic empowerment. Somalis have to be helped to be reorientated and to be able to deal with the underlying issues onto this. Because arming one side is almost as if saying that, well, let's make this side defeat the other. The so-called war on terror never ever explained the background to terrorism. When I was growing up at high school, the terror was about those hijackings, and it was about things to do with the Palestinian question. All these other things still go back to that. We will, for me as a Christian, we will still have to go back and address the underlying issues to these things, including things that have brought Islamic terrorism. Because don't forget, as I hinted, there was Christian terrorism in Ireland.
Yes.
I know people, including reverends, who are saying, never shall we talk to these terrorists. The reality is the so-called terrorists are effectively in charge of the two islands.
Of course, the IRA has, over the years, very effectively stated that it can use extremism in pursuit of justice.
But again,
and the political solution has settled it, and the majority, if you like, view ideologically presented through the democratic process.
All right, let's try to attempt to find solutions to Africa's problems. Mozambique's Maputo Accord for Peace and National Reconciliation suggested a combination of demilitarization and reintegration. That is, of course, effects of wars and stuff, reintegrating communities. Demilitarization is a hard one, and many countries have attempted it. We are still grappling with it in northern Uganda, demilitarizing the Karamajong. It also suggested another combination, decentralization and devolution. Kenya has attempted the devolution question, and I don't know whether I don't know whether you're saying it's working or not by your reaction, but you're going to have to give us a perspective on that. Decentralization and devolution, demilitarization and reintegration. Each of you should tackle one. Devolution and decentralization, does it work for African communities?
Well, first of all, before I answer that exactly, you talked about the Maputo.
The Maputo Accord for Peace,
which I think worked. But see, what has worked in our case, and by the way, starting from the options we've had, even we have failed just a few weeks back in the Democratic Republic of Congo by sending the forces of East African Community, and they failed. Remember that time when M23 was at, I think that was around 2013, when George Bush came to Tanzania, and Barack Obama was also in Tanzania. At that time, Uganda was saying we are not part of this, even when the UN report had come out. And that is when Tanzania opted to get out of being active from East Africa to lean more towards SADC. And as even we are talking, you can, of course, Tanzania is now back in full swing with the new president. But you see that the options we are having of addressing the conflict in the region are not doing well. For example, I would have the Maputo Accord was better because there was reintegration. But for example, if you go to Democratic Republic of Congo, where we had forces, and DRC, by the way, this again hints back to that people must get involved. Kenya was telling you that they were not even able to pay for their own electricity of the forces where these people were going to be staying or doing the command.
Kenya also has a general who has chickened out.
And then we also see East African community failing totally at that. So I think reintegration would be very, very important, in that these guys who are fighting, the warring parties, would know that they are also going to be brought to be part of the...
In other words, there is no blueprint that offers trust to all parties involved.
The moment you try to send them away,
then will be settling scores on them, and they are afraid of that.
Yeah, and when you bring in the devolution point, I think for Kenya, whether it has failed or not, I think they have attempted, and I think they are still trying to fight to make sure that it works. For them, they have started.
Yeah.
For us, which we have not done. We've seen some governors complaining that if we have devolution that works effectively, our counties are going to have enough resources, the medical services will be okay, education, social services. So I think at least Kenya has started.
Okay.
The question is to other countries, whether we are willing to learn or not to learn.
Our own attempts at decentralization have had their fits and starts.
What is decentralization in Uganda? Decentralization when the chief executive will go ahead and commission a tap in Butaleja. That's no decentralization. But no, serious. No, it's been shambles in Uganda. But generally, actually, I am really not big on these processes, except that I believe that the continent really needs a situation in which all citizens feel substantially engaged. But where there, in a country like Uganda, where there is big national identity questions, yes, devolution, rather decentralization, works to the extent that actually it makes communities feel a sense of ownership. All those things require open and genuine democracy. In Uganda, I don't know when you have a situation in which even a by-election for an LC1 chairman, invokes the military to attend, invokes the head of state to ask for emergency budget and things like that. I'm not quite sure whether it will work. But for the Mozambicans, it's very interesting, considering how these guys battled a very, very vicious post-independence conflict. Kudos to them. They seem to have opened, but you know what happened? In Mozambique, the leader of opposition and the governing political party can sit and have a conversation. There is a possibility that opposition party may win power. Power balance is by and large, realistically possible. So when you look at it from that perspective, it is okay. Generally, yes. The more local authorities, in this case, whether district councils, sub-regional councils, take ownership and get granted resources to be able to do so, it works, and I would encourage it. And very quickly, I know we've got to go. In Kenya's case, actually, I'm quite engaged with some of the leaders there, and it seems to be rather quite impressive. Every now and again you see county governors commissioning things, and they say, this is what we're commissioning, this is new, 50% from central government, 50% from local government, 50% to investors. It seems to work, but of course within the context of this, I'm not quite sure whether that is something which is feasible in Uganda.
All right, gentlemen, many thanks for the perspective on the impact of the conflict in Somalia on the region. Joseph Otieno, political analyst, many thanks. Many thanks to you too. Alawi Semanda, international relations expert and a scholar for that. Whether we can find African solutions to African problems continues to be something that shall be tackled at all stages. Here on Morning at NTV, we are glad to amplify that cause.